design, design guidelines plus zoning, so we can bring, I hope, some flexibility, creativity to this. All of this pretty much we have in-house. We have architects, we have planners, we have zoning people. On the other hand, we are not a huge firm, and so we are not, to use a outrageous example, we're not AECON, which has 100,000 people. In other words, you're going to get our senior level. Susan and I will be here, Paul Buckhurst, the people we just mentioned, those are the people going to work on this. And I think if you check any of our references we gave you, we're pretty, have a pretty good record of on time, on budget performance. We just did some work for Riverhead, did some work for North Hempstead that I mentioned, so any of those would be references for us. And then I just wanted to end on these few slides, and these are just impressions. I happened to be here last weekend, and I just decided to look at a couple of streets. One was in your historic, if I understood it, this is post crossing. And so I just want to look at the old, I don't want to call this the old Southampton. I just wanted to say, a street that seemed to me was, had older homes on it, smaller lot sizes, and I just thought it was a kind of beautiful older street, and something that the new urbanists, by the way, all, if you talk to someone like an Andres Duani out of Yale, who's very influenced by New England, and you got a curb, and you got 5 feet between the curb and the sidewalk. The old sidewalk's only 4 feet wide, and you have 25 feet to the house, and it's a very sort of New England and East End, tradition of older development, and I think people, I don't know the reaction, my reaction is pretty positive to this street, and I presume that it's something that probably you'd like to preserve in this type of atmosphere. On the other hand, I went to some other streets. I just happened on near the railroad station, and took a look at Pulaski Street and what's going on there, and how these new houses are being built, and how the architects are responding to your code. And they're substantial, but they seem to meet the, they seem to be within the requirements of the code, if I understand these pretty much. And I'm being a little unfair on this one because there's no landscaping in yet, and landscaping is going to make a big difference. But there are details of these houses that zoning might not control, but if we had some design guidelines or detailed guidelines, it might help on some of these. I was just looking at, this looks newer to me, but it was, this is going down to Old Town Crossing. And I was looking at this house because it's sort of vertical, fits into its lot size, and I was looking at houses near it. And near it, or wider, they're filling up the envelope, is what they're doing. And I'm not saying this is bad architecture, but again, it's filling up the envelope. So we need to look at these ideas, and it struck me, one of the things that strikes me is this is not easy. This needs to be, how you've outlined the RFP, the request for proposal, I think is wise, because we need some good data, and we need to develop that carefully with your building department, with you, and possibly with some of the architects, attorneys, developers, so we get at least their perspective. And I'm not at all, I just want to be knowledgeable so that when we do have the workshops, to get public input, we know all the details, and we can provide different options and examples of what we might be able to do. So I leave you with this image, sort of. It's a dilemma for me, and it's a nice house. Just happens to be on a compared to the other houses on the street, it's a little bit, fills the envelope a little bit. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
So, I think you've defined the issues well. I think one of the hardest things for us in this conversation about residential zoning is people don't agree on the facts. So when you have meetings, people say things that not as, so for example, you use Post Crossing, which is a great street, another one, Elm Street in the same neighborhood. People will say, well, under the zoning, you could never build Elm Street today and Elm Street's in this street. But no one really knows whether that's the case or not. So I think, first of all, I think it's going to be very, very important for us, as you said, to pick the right lots to get a sense of, really, if you're going to build Post Crossing or Elm Street today, and we can pick other streets, how would the zoning work? Would our current zoning work for those houses? Because I think the one thing there is pretty unanimous agreement that those are great streets with great houses. That doesn't seem to be an issue here. It's more people thinking that the houses they're building are actually very similar to those houses. That's something we need to study. Secondly, I think the key for us is going to be, and you got into it a bit, is someone who's going to be able to interact with the architects and perhaps the developers who are building here, so at least we can all agree on the facts with them, even if we may not agree totally on what should be built, but at least where we get to a point where we can agree on the facts. Because I think there are there are several architects who do an enormous amount of work in the village. They're certainly very proud of their work. They think it's good architecture, something's not working in the process now. And I guess one of the things I just want to mention, just to open it up, but just want to mention is we will also be working with the Architectural Review Board, because we are just the Planning Commission, we're only an advisory board. The Architectural Review Board is where most of these houses end up. And I think one of the things we heard very clearly from them when we had our own sort of workshop meeting with them is they feel that, number one, when the project comes to the building department doesn't have the tools to give it the review it should be getting before it gets to them. And then when it gets to them, they don't have a specific set of tools that allows them to decide whether what's being proposed is appropriate to the lot or not. And it's always very hard when a house has already gone through a good step of the process for the last person in the process to say, no, I want you to redesign. It's never a good place to be. So I think part of this is to try to make sure that when something gets into the process, it gets into the process the right way, so that the ARB is not in place, as I think they were with this house, do the application for the building department, which takes off an enormous workload off the building department, and also it's in some way insulates the building department from accusations that they're favoring one over the other, because some outside expert is just opining whether it meets the zoning. So that was one issue that came up as a possibility. And the other that we've talked about is actually the Planning Commission here is purely advisory. We don't review individual applications. There's a planning board, there's a ZBA, and there's an ARB, and each of them act basically in a silo at this point. So something goes to the building department, it then goes, in most cases, goes to the ZBA first. It passes the ZBA, goes to the ARB, and so a little bit of what happens is the ARB is faced with something that, from the owner's point of view, has got two levels of being approved, and the owner is like sitting there saying, why are you giving me a hard time? I've already gone through the process, and gets very upset when the ARB does what they're by law supposed to do, which is say whether this fits into the context of the neighborhood. So one of the other things that's been talked about from time to time, and it'd be very helpful to us to understand what other places are doing, is do you basically have a process where the boards meet as a group and talk about an application at the beginning of the process, so they somehow take a coordinated approach, each bringing their own judgment to it, but take a coordinated approach to review. So I know those are two things that in the past have been raised, but at this point nothing's changed in the process. Some of the laws have changed.
I'd like to make a comment. When I was on the ARB board, we had a situation with the zoning board. It was a historic property, and they told the people that they would have to move this historic structure. Well, the ZBA doesn't have the authority to allow this, so I had to go to ZBA, and we had a hell of a fight at that meeting. I'm thinking maybe the applicant should go to the ARB board first, and then to the zoning board. I think it should be reversed, because we were always the last one on the end of the line to tell the people, no, you can't do this, and then all of a sudden sparks would fly.
Yeah. There is, I think, very legitimate concern. We see it in a lot of municipalities, and you are different here. For instance, in Greenwich, You know, the building department is a dozen people. Greenwich is a town, and people don't realize that it's 70,000 people. When you walk into the Greenwich Town Hall,
Right,
it's about, safely, 6 or 7 times the size of this town
right,
hall.
right.
So here it's different. You have the building department, well, when I was working before, I thought there was only 2 or 3 people
Yeah.
in the building department. So
Yep.
that idea in New
Right.
York State, particularly upstate, they use outside advisors to help
Right.
the building department and sometimes the planning board,
Right.
planning commission.
Right,
So that, and you do that against an escrow account.
right,
Now, builders here, I would think, in Southampton, would be more amenable to that type of thing because it's time versus money. And
Right.
So,
right.
that might be something that
Right.
is considered. So
It's also
there's-
been-
There's these,
You know, one of the problems with small towns, as I'm sure you've realized in working in small towns, is people at various levels have to decide something and then they see the person in the grocery store the next day. So it's very difficult, and so one of the things that appealed to me about it is, you know, if an outside expert says, we don't think that you're followed the zoning appropriately, or we think your 32 feet is really 33 feet, or whatever it is, it's a little easier than the building inspector, and if the outside expert misses it, in a way, better they miss it than the building inspector, and then there's, people think it's done for some nefarious reason. So it does give, I think, a little bit of more neutrality to the process. I think one of the things that we as a planning commission have really emphasized is trying to make the process as fair and neutral as we can, so that we don't get into the issues that we've had, people feeling they're not getting treated, not everyone's treated the same way.
I think also is to speed the process along.
Right.
Not like the town. The town is terribly slow. I mean, they can get a permit much faster in the village than you can get in the town.
Questions
Yeah.
from the audience? Any?
Well, I know you want to talk to architects and builders, but for those of us who live in these endangered neighborhoods, really, time is of the essence. Coverage of the lot, I mean, this house, if you go behind it, did you look behind there? Sir?
I did not go behind the house. I was afraid of,
You
I
can
was here
see-
on Sunday and there weren't many
You
police
can
cruisers
see it
around.
from
but
another street,
Yeah,
from Toilsome Place, which maybe on your way out you might
Yeah.
cruise past if the gates are open, because you
what
probably...
street again?
Toilsome Place.
Toilsome Place.
You would go out and turn left go out South Main, turn left on the 2nd Street, and turn left on Toilsome Place. It has a number of other support buildings and basically covers the entire lot with a kind of, I mean, I find it unattractive.
Oh, I'm sorry, those I did see
Yeah.
from an angle. And in fact, I have
Well,
a
you should-
photograph of them. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I think, I live on Toilsome,
Okay.
but to me, this really is an issue, and so is the enormous lot coverage and the lack of perhaps grass. You know, we have this parking thing, that's an issue that you'll probably encounter, where, yes, we don't want them to park on the street, because, by the way, on that street, I don't think a fire truck can get down the street if people park on the street, which I've never thought of this in my life, but that was brought up here. And it is, it turns out to be a big issue, but something, so this is like, to me, the poster child of what I do not want to have happening. I am a property owner. I feel my rights so far have not been curtailed, but I do want you to understand that there are people here who feel that their property rights, the residential property owners who are not in the building trade, we need to be protected, and I think we feel exposed. So I'm begging you. I understand why you would talk to those other people, and I think that's important, but you also need to consider us. That's all, because this is a beautiful village. It's close to being built out and unattractive in my head. So anytime you can get going on that this kind of thing is what is really being done now, which is why this is happening.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for coming. So the planning commission back in, I think, 2007, passed a revision of the zoning code of the residential zoning code in the small lots. And that's the first time the zoning code had been looked at since, I believe, 1963 was the time for that. And at that time, for the first time, we introduced the concept of zoning floor area in the village. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think even more important than the PFA
Right,
is the fact that we changed the zoning from geographical location
right.
to size of the lot.
Right.
Because you would get R20 lots and R12, 12.5 lots, which has the development rights of 12.5, and therefore suddenly you got these enormous houses in small lots because they had greater development rights than they should have.
Right.
So that was, I think, a more important thing.
Right, so it was a significant reform, and I think at least in the early years seemed to us to be working. More recently, and particularly once the economy recovered, we started to see much larger houses getting built in the small lots than any of us anticipated could be built under the zoning we had passed. And the trustees took a small step, I would say, probably is the right way to put it, to try to address some of the issues by tightening the height limits in the smaller lots, basically bringing it down to 32 feet for most of the lots, from 35. And also, we placed restrictions on, we created a much tighter definition of bedrooms, which in effect placed a restriction on how much parking spots you were required to have. So that was a small step, but we all realized that if we're going to address the development of large houses and small lots, we have to go for further. So what we want to do at this point is something that's, I would say, very interactive and practical. So is to really look at, as I think we said in the RFP, to look at some of the older houses in the village, see how they would be built under the current zoning. Could you actually build those houses currently?
Yeah.
And then look at some of the larger houses and try to understand how they're different or the same as those older houses, and test various zoning concepts. Would they create the older houses? Because I guess the one thing I would say is there's a fairly large consensus in the village that there's older houses on some of the classic older streets in the village that everyone likes and thinks are good. And if we could build those again, that would be great. So that's the idea. And one of the things I think that we want to do this time is, certainly this is going to be all open to the public, but also invite, in fact, the architects who practice in the village and the developers who build in the village, and let them be part of the process so that we pass something that actually works.
Yeah.
Because one of the things they have said in the past is, you pass these laws and it results either in bad houses or we can't build under them, and therefore we have to ask for variances. So you want to make sure whatever we pass is something they agree, at least works, whether or not they agree on the policy. And then I think the final comment I would make before you start is, we also want to involve the building department, because one of the things I think we found with the most recent law is we can pass a law, but if the building department doesn't understand it or doesn't think it's clear how they should interpret it, it's not worth a lot. So we really want to address that. So with that, I'll let you introduce yourselves and make your presentation.
Sure. Okay, great. My name is George James. This is Michael Kortler. And today we prepared a short presentation, essentially to go over who we are, our approach, and our approach is going to be a very detailed case study for what we did in Scarsdale, which had very similar questions to what you're facing here. I'm going to go very quickly through our proposal and then question and answers. However, if you have questions during the presentation, please just come out and say them, and Michael will jump in when he has comments as well. So, the Environmental Simulation Center, we'll start there, was founded in 1991 at the New School for Social Research. And the idea is that there was all these new technologies coming online that can be harnessed to help make better planning and design decisions. And the center started as kind of a research laboratory of how do we use those tools to help make better planning and design decisions. It built the 3D GIS database of Lower Manhattan, floor by floor, in the mid-90s, which was way before Google Earth, way before a lot of technologies that we have today. And still, there are things about it that were really innovative. Michael and I got to know each other in the development of CommunityViz, which is a decision support system that was developed for planning. And you could take...
That actually we developed
Yes, right.
painfully.
Painfully.
Never to do software again.
Yeah. This was a while ago. Michael and I were working with different organizations. He was the ESC and the founder of the ESC, whereas I was working with Coopers and Lybrand at the time. But we got to know each other because we worked very closely on the project, developing different components of the software. And it's still out there. CommunityViz is something that planners still use today, although it's changed a lot since we've worked on it, and we still use it. Now, after the development of CommunityViz, we really stopped doing application development and really started applying these tools to planning and design problems. And the most important thing about applying these tools to planning and design problems, if you really want to make a difference, is development regulations. Because ultimately you could develop a great plan, but if you don't actually implement the plan through some sort of development regulations, you're going to have, it's never going to be realized. And so Michael has known this all of his career. He wrote the Housing Quality Zoning, which was part of New York City zoning, essentially the first contextual zoning resolution, or contextual component of the zoning code in New York City, which evolved into quality housing zoning, which is what New York has now. We both worked on the Glencoe Visual Simulation Ordinance, which you may have heard about. And I've been working with independently with Kingston, Tuxedo Park, some other places as well on their zoning. Now, one of the places we've worked with is the Village of Scarsdale. And it's so interesting to hear you talk, Paul, because the Village of Scarsdale had a really similar question. They essentially, in 2002, to address out-of-scale or Bigfoot houses that they were getting in the village, they adopted floor area ratios. And it was a sliding scale. Essentially, you got more floor area on a percentage basis for small lots, less on large lots. But they also included these bonuses and penalties. So if if you have big dormers, your attic counts as floor area. If you have small dormers, it doesn't. If you put your basement in the garage, or your basement in the, your garage in the basement, it ends up being penalized. But if you put it on the first floor, it doesn't. There's a number. You get bonuses for setting back further from the minimum on the side yards. A whole series of elements that essentially modify your base FAR number. And their question was, after a few years of the regulations being in place, they said, how are they performing? And that question of actually going back and looking at your regulations to see how they're performing, it is disappointingly rare, because not a lot of places actually do that.
Right.
And it was a wonderful question, because if you're asked that question in an open-ended way, it's like, all right, well, let's solve the problem, because there's not necessarily a ready-baked solution out there for you. You've got to figure it out. So we're going to go through one of the components of figuring out this problem, which is essentially illustrative of one of the approaches that we use. So the first step involved modeling buildings built prior to the regulations, the so-called problem buildings. All right, so this is one of the buildings, and I have down over here, I say notice the camera, because you'll be seeing a lot of images of this building taken from this camera. And because one of the things that, let me back up for a second, because you have to measure, right? If you're going to evaluate something, you want to measure it. And when somebody says that house is too big, well, what do they mean? Right? And it's like getting to the definition of what the problem is more than half the battle, right? You've got to, if you come to some sort of conclusion on what the problem is, then, well, then you can start taking steps to approach it. But I know it when I see it. That is not a good way forward. You've got to be able to measure, yes.
Well, it's one thing to measure the house itself, but it's also you have to measure it within context.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, oh, absolutely, indeed, indeed. Now,
Actually, that's where we ended up.
Oh, okay.
What they had was a generalized set of regulations. And when it was applied to specific situations, whether it was a corner lot, a larger lot, a smaller lot, the results were really unanticipated. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the proposed building bore almost no relationship to the existing context.
yeah,
And New York City is contextual zonings like that. It's essentially form-based zoning, it's not contextual. You come up with a form and you legislate the form, and to some degree, that's what they tried to do in Scarsdale.
now, I mean, ultimately, when you
Tried to
take, right, when you take all of the regulations and put them together, in terms of coverage, height, setback, it was essentially doing that, yes, that is correct. But we're saying, we developed this measure called appearance of bulk, and it's the percentage of the image. So you have that camera, this picture, this photo, or this image right here is taken from that digital camera that was put on the left lot line as you face it, and it had set with a 55 degree lens, and so it takes a picture that's this size. And so the appearance of bulk of this image is you take the area of the house and the area of the image, and you calculate a percent. So you end up with a number that says, all right, well, this house is, from this point, 9.48% of the field of view of this camera. All right? Now, this is a house that is not buildable under their current code, right? So it was built right before the code went into effect. It is, these are all the calculations here, but essentially it was 643 feet too big. The maximum allowable square foot for a 5,000 square foot lot was 2,150, and ultimately with all the bonuses it could get a little bigger, but it was still too big. So the exercise was, what do we need to do to the house without changing the design intent to make it comply with the FAR? And it's a wonderful exercise because it's a puzzle. It's a problem to solve. And in this case, what we ended up doing was we brought the garage out of the basement, which exempted that area from the floor area. And now we had too much floor area, so we ended up having to modify the house a little bit. And then we essentially did the same calculation, and we showed how effective the modification was to make it work. And then, so we developed these series of images. It's the same house. That's the camera view, the unified camera view that we use to measure, but this is an aerial front view, rear view, plan view, and then all of the data associated with it. So that's the existing house. Again, it was over by 643 feet. We modified it. I'll go back so you can see it again. Look at the top here, and you can see how it changes. And it's outlined in red. So the previous house is outlined in red, so you can see the change from this image. And now it's 11 feet under the maximum FAR. And the change of the appearance of bulk was very small. It was less than 1%. Now, other houses, like this one, which is over by over 1,000 square feet, it's much more effective. So essentially, in this case, what we ended up doing was we again brought the basement, or the garage out of the basement, but then we increased the setbacks. So as I said, remember there's bonuses and penalties. You avoid the penalties, and you get the bonus when you're modifying these houses to essentially minimize your loss. So during this exercise, we're not making a good house. We're trying to maximize the size of the house, as any developer might, but still trying to keep the intent. But it's not necessarily meant to improve it, just to make it comply. So in this case, the appearance of bulk ended up being significant, 5.6%. And I'll do that one more again. one more time. Now, it didn't always work. So this is a big lot, 65,000 square feet. House is almost 4,000 square feet over. The basement counts as floor area. The attic counts as floor area, largely because they have a 3-foot rule. The basement can't extend more than 3 feet, and if it extends more than 3 feet, it counts as floor area. These dormers were too big, according to their rules. They needed to be smaller to exempt it from the floor area. So we modified the house, and essentially making the dormers smaller, lowering the basement, so none of that stuff, the attic and the basement no longer count as floor area. That gave us too much floor area, so we had to increase the size of the house. Essentially on the side here, you'll notice that there's a little half-story. We ended up bringing it up to the second story, and it actually increased the appearance of bulk. I'll do that one more time. And then again, the red outline is the previous house. Anyways, we went through this exercise for a number of houses. Oh, and this was showing if they put it right at the front lot line, the minimum required front lot line and setback, it would be even much, much bigger, but they hadn't done that. And we played through this a number of these. This one just is easy enough to fix, makes a little change. And then we played through variations on themes. But I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but essentially the findings were that the regulations were marginally to moderately effective at reducing the appearance of bulk, in the single digits. But the effectiveness varied a lot according to the lot size. In the small lots, it was effective. In the large lots, but were only marginally impacted because you had a lot of options in terms of taking advantage of bonuses in the large lots. But the regulations weren't contextual. And to your point about, well, what's next door? Well, the regulations didn't address what was next door, so they weren't part of this exercise. And that was part of what's come out of this, is that, well, maybe it needs to actually start looking at what's next door. Because this is another Scarsdale neighborhood, is that, you have a lot of variation according to lot size. You have that lot is many times larger than the lots that abut it. But even in this case, you end up with a house that's much larger in this 9,300 square foot lot compared to the house that's on a 5,700 square foot lot. So if you have an FAR ruling your house size, you end up with real variation in house sizes in the same neighborhood. But my point of bringing this up is that we're coming in here agnostic as far as what method to use to study the problem. It may be photographs, it may be textured 3D models, which is what you see up here, linked to plans. It may be other measures of data. What we think is that the problem and the expectations, your expectations and your trustees' expectations, should determine the method that we use to study it. There are lots of tools out there to address the issue. But I think, in our proposal, we added a phase 1, which was to define the issue and to learn the regulatory environment. And in your RFP, you talk about harmonious development. And we could spend a lot of time trying to talk about what that means and defining it. But ultimately, the success of the project is to define it. If you're not able to define what is meant by harmonious development, then it's I don't know how you get to a good solution. And you got to be able to define it. And I think that's why we.
I think it's both a combination. I can interrupt you.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just defining it. Excuse me. Oh, it's okay. I can go. It's not just defining it, but it's really creating a vocabulary so that everybody sitting around the table could actually understand what everybody else is thinking.
Yeah.
It's notorious that architects' renderings are ridiculous. One of the reasons for the use of all the simulations is to be able to give people a sense that A, it's honest, and all of this is measurable, et cetera, so it's accountable, it's not just pretty pictures. And the other is that we manipulate all of this, and typically in real time, with folks so that you can actually see what your choices are. So I think a lot of what we've done in the past is use these tools, and we've written lots of different kinds of zoning, is a way to frame people's choices. Here are your questions. And if you do go this way, here are the implications of going that way, and so on. So the idea is to make the process both visually understandable using simulation and accountable, because it's actually an ongoing record of what people say and think and how they're responding to things and so on. And then if you go back again, a couple of years later after you've done the modifications, you then have the opportunity to say, well, this is what we meant, and we actually have a whole record, and is it performing the way we meant it, which sometimes means that it's actually doing better than you thought, or worse than you thought, so it goes in a lot of different directions. But it's a good part of this process is about communication and getting people to actually have a common vocabulary.
Okay. All right, so that's phase one that we added to this. Again, I think it's very important to get that. I think Michael brought up some great points about it. Phase two, we left the other phases as you've described them in the proposal, gathering existing documentation, working with you to get the data necessary to study the issue. And phase three, describe data describing existing conditions. Now, again, my point to that is that will be design. Whatever we use to communicate that, the issues at hand, will be designed with you. And again, we're fairly agnostic as far as what methods we use to describe it. It's a method that works for you. And we like doing things in 3D. I think that's fairly well known about our way of doing things, because that's the way people experience the world. But again, it may not be what's required for this exercise.
I mean, I think what is good about the 3D probably is you see the house in the context of a lot.
Yeah.
So we have a tendency to just think of the house in the context of the facade of the street.
Yeah.
But the people who live next door
Or behind.
are experiencing it all around.
Yeah.
So you may have a house that looks beautiful on the street, but if you're next door and the house has a wall going all the way back, then the experience of the house for you as the neighbor, it may be very different than someone may drive by and say, well, that's a perfectly nice house, like what's wrong with that?
Yeah, right.
Right, so I think I think one of the things that we have talked about is some of this is, something that I think we don't totally understand is, you talk about trying to understand what the problem is, which I think is the hardest part of this.
Absolutely.
Because people, I think, don't really understand themselves what they think the problem is how much of it is house size and how much of it is lot coverage. So by that I mean, we certainly have streets historically in the village, Elm Street, Post Crossing, many others, that had big houses on them.
Yeah.
They were the McMansions of their day.
Yeah, right.
Right? But that was all they had in the lot. Right? And then the lot was deep and had grass and trees and whatever else it had. Maybe a horse or whatever. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now the house has, house, pool house, garage, pool, maybe they can squeeze it in a tennis court.
Right.
And so I think sometimes when people talk about house size, I'm not sure how much of it they're talking about is house size and how much of it they're really responding to a context of a lot of building area on a lot as opposed to just a house.
Right. Right.
Right. So that's maybe how the 3D model works, is it allows us to show more than just the house. It's actually a 3D model, the house, garage, the pool house, and how that works in a neighborhood.
Right. It can. I mean, I will say that one of the downsides to the 3D model that was pointed out most recently, and we revisited this work at Scarsdale this year, and one of the points that the current board had brought up was, the landscaping is really important, and big trees, and so you build these new houses, and they're bare, right? There's a bare lot, and then 15 years later, the trees grow, and they don't bother people as much as they used to, and it's harder to represent the landscaping in a 3D model.
Well, but I think that's why we want to look back at the old houses. So again,
Right.
one context I think we sometimes have is people look at these big new houses and they say, oh, they're horrible. And the other side of it, just to be fair, is they look at a 3-story house on Post Crossing and it has enormous trees and a 9-foot hedge and, you know, all that stuff, and the house doesn't look to them the same as when you build a house on a different street, and now they're seeing that, probably when they built that house, you know, there's some great old photos of Southampton before there were trees. So there's these lots, you see these houses built, particularly in the estate section, and you're like, you tried to do that today, you would be executed, you know? I mean, they look enormous. So, you know, now we see them 100 years later, completely surrounded by trees and hedges, and they don't have the same size. So I think part of what we're trying to do is say, you know, sometimes zoning goes too far in effect, I think. If the houses on Post Crossing, we all think are great houses, and they work under the zoning, then maybe what we're talking about is how do you do what's happened on Post Crossing in Elm over the last 100 years, rather than try to create a zoning context that's not going to work.
Right.
Or we find out, in fact, the house on Post Crossing, while it looks big, may in fact not be as bulky as some of the new houses being built. And that's, I think, part of what's concerning to us and what we want the consultant to do is get everyone to agree on what the facts are.
Right.
Because we had a public hearing before the last law passed, and half the room said, you know, the problem with all the zoning is you could never build the old houses everyone loves. And the other half of the room said the problem with the zoning is no one's building the houses that everyone used to love. So it's either one or the other. So we'd like to, so it's be very helpful for us to understand which it is.
Right.
Very helpful.
All right, so the one thing I did want to make certain that we talked about, if we can, is the focus sections. We wrote them into the proposal as you described. We also proposed adding time to them, and we thought that you have an aggressive schedule,
Right.
3 meetings within a month, which includes holiday time, and if there was a reason that, you know, we could work within it if there's a good reason, but we were recommending to have add another month at the end of this into January. It's just a bear to do back-to-back meetings like that. At least that's my opinion.
I just want to make one comment. When they built those houses on Post Crossing, there were no automobiles. They were mostly horse and wagons. We have now, and they didn't finish the attics, and they didn't finish the basements.
Right.
And most of them were either 3 or 4 bedroom, maybe 2 bathrooms, maybe 1. And we're not faced with having 6 bedrooms or 8 bedrooms and no parking. And that seems to be a major issue. It's what we're also looking at.
Right. I mean, and this is like, I like your approach in terms of looking at these buildings, looking at and see how they perform under the current zoning. Do they comply? And then if they don't, what do you have to do to make them comply and still keep the spirit of the house the same? I mean, it's a wonderful problem.
Actually, because I used to do this presentation for the city and the AIA about all of the wonderful housing in New York City that you can't build under the current regulations,
Right.
which are pretty much almost all of the landmark buildings
Right.
and so on. And so the recent revisions that city planning has come up with, in part, actually attempt to allow you to build some of these things now by changing courts and a variety of other things. So the approach of looking at what's been built, what are the qualities of them, some of them you can quantify and some you can't because they're time-based. One of the things we did for Glen Cove in the submission to the visual simulation ordinance is you had to show the succession build-out really of the landscape in order to get approval, and that was modeled in 3D and real time as well. It's more at the end of a project than at the beginning, but it essentially really requires somebody to think about how you are really going to do this and what it might look like at the end rather than looking at it in the beginning, and went way beyond looking at massing models.
Right. Glen Cove, absolutely.
I'm assuming you have the in-house expertise to do zoning text, to write zoning text. And,
I guess so.
Yeah.
and obviously also, you know, when we did the zoning for the village center,
Yeah.
which was very limited to the business district you're sitting in now.
Yeah.
One of the things we did for the first time is we not only did new zoning text, we also did design guidelines,
Yeah.
and the hope was that And is that when the building department now gets an application in the business, in the village center, they can look to the design, and well, first of all, the applicant can look to the design guidelines and understand what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And then the building department can look at the design guidelines and say, did the applicant actually follow the design guidelines? So not just the zoning text that, dormers
Yeah.
30 feet apart, but also the design guidelines in terms of how you were supposed to deal with a facade and all that. So
Yeah.
we're looking for someone who can help do both potentially, if that's where we end up.
Absolutely. And in terms of the zoning text, Michael has enormously more experience than I do. I've been doing work in this area, but he's been doing work in this area a lot longer than I have. And so I would rely upon him. I'd probably do a lot of the legwork, and he would end up doing a lot of the reviewing and telling me where I messed up.
Writing the text is the easy part. I mean, one of the things we do is, first of all, we write it in plain English.
Yes.
Right.
When I wrote the city's first contextual regulations, the council, you remember Norman? He looked at me and he said, Michael, this isn't zoning. I said, all it has to do is meet a constitutional due process value. It doesn't have to look like, the standard zoning regulations from 1916. And they were adopted. They were performance-based, which is very different than when you're doing form-based. In other words, what performance did when we adopted housing quality zoning in the 70s, essentially the height and setback regulations were a contextual urban design analysis. You had to look at the buildings on your side of the block, the ones on the other side of the block, predominant street wall heights, and so on. And actually, within that, then make a series of decisions. But it was the kind of thing, basically, it was building in what a decent architect should be doing, which is go to the site and pay attention. And we were able to quantify that. And then there was a passing score. We never got involved in the issue of aesthetics in that one, because it was meant to be generic as of right zoning. But when you're dealing with sensitive areas, aesthetics are a critical piece of it. And it can be done either by design guidelines or best practices or any variety of things. It depends on how far you want to go to try to legislate a particular aesthetic or a range of aesthetics.
Questions?
Yeah, Bob,
Okay. Anybody else?
That's it. We're in question and answer.
Yeah.
So that was interesting, your last comment about the range of things that could deal with I guess what we call harmonious development, which we all agree is the tricky thing to define. In your experience in other jurisdictions, what types of either design guidelines or best practices have towns or villages used to get to that issue?
Most of them haven't been very successful. Form-based zoning has become very popular because it's kind of call it a canned approach. So you think by legislating a particular form that it will fit everywhere in certain densities and lot sizes and so on. And I think what most places are finding, and to some degree Scarsdale, they thought they were actually doing form-based without quite getting all the way there, was that trying to legislate a form that would kind of fit almost any situation within, let's say, a zoning category, barely works. Sometimes you hit it on the head, but most of the time it doesn't really match. So I think that's, for me, that's really problematic because you just don't know. The second is if you want to have regulations that have a long shelf life rather than ones which are designed to solve last year's problem, one of the nice things about performance and looking at the context is that it changes over time. And it's true, people, I think, do get habituated to some things that may be even egregious,
right.
Like the pink house and everything else is natural shingles. Maybe not out here. But anyway, but that kind of thing. Most of them have adopted really form-based regulations, and I think they're finding that it's not a panacea. It works when you start from scratch.
So just define form, what you mean by
Oh, I'm sorry.
form-based.
Yeah.
And what you mean by performance.
Okay.
Yeah, give an example of what would be form-based and what would be a
Okay.
performance.
So form-based is essentially, you come up, let's say in a middle density district, you come up with a building form which you think will more or less fit a lot of different contexts. And you design the regulations that are essentially a very fixed envelope. You go up this high, maybe you have to set back, you have to have a pitched roof, you have to have 16 dormers, and the maximum building height, interesting is.
You're talking about side lot setbacks.
Yeah, all of that, the
height.
coverage, et cetera.
It often, it
Lot
often
coverage.
regulates porches, like you
Right,
have porches
and
here,
porches
your
and things
garage
like that.
must be there.
Right.
It can be very,
So you're really talking beyond setbacks to
Yes.
the,
It's
to the
it's
build to
actually,
the
it-
house.
it's actually, form-based zoning can go as far as actually pre-configure the form of the building. In other words, it has to have a pitched roof, the pitched roof can't be less than 45 degrees, it has to be perpendicular. You can't use hip roofs, because in this town we don't have hip roofs, and so on and so forth. So trying to do anything other than that particular form. And also that form has been designed kind of shrink-wrapped in order to fill, all of the floor area that you're granted by the municipality is designed to fit into the shape. If you want to, so you're going to maximize all of that, you pretty much end up with something that to some degree is cookie cutter, but the variations might be different kinds of porches and so on. It depends on really how far you want to go. The original place that did this is Seaside in Florida, but that was a new town. So they basically said, on this lot, the building is going to look like this, on this lot it's going to look like that. It's kind of charming, but this isn't a city, or it isn't a place where people actually get to exercise their own sensibilities at the same time. Performance, on the other hand, says, pay attention. It says that there are actually multiple right answers to any problem, and there are multiple right solutions for any given context. And you begin by looking around you and quantifying what that context is. Lot coverage, there are the mechanical ones, lot coverage, setbacks, and so on. But then there's also, are there predominantly porches, which essentially is a kind of screen for the building behind it. How high is the front wall of the building? What are the kinds of roof shapes, and so on. And you essentially create an urban design analysis, and that becomes the basis of what you do in that particular context. And that it could be objectively scored. At least what we wrote for the city a long time ago was all very objectively scoreable. You had to, and it was how you decided what the trade-offs were. It also incorporated more than just urban design. There were 3 other sections that talked about the building interior, because as an architect, you design both the interior and the exterior. You just don't do the outside and hope for the best that you actually can shtup something interesting on the inside. There was recreation space, which was actually dealing with the real use of outdoor space, not just calling it open space. And because it was New York City, there was a whole security and safety thing, which really had to do with courtyard housing and controls of entries and visibility. So the idea is we put these all together, and out of all of that, you had 100 points. You had to get 85. I didn't care how you got them. And to give you one example, where the city came up with form-based zoning for the Upper West Side, which made it impossible to do twin tower buildings, which are really the significant buildings on the Upper West Side. Using what we wrote, and the firm did a twin tower building, but it meant that they had to make some choices about privacy and light and air and through ventilation and so on. But essentially, performance throws is a kind of the public program, and it throws the problem back to the architect and the developer, rather than form-based, which really solves everything in advance and says you just have to comply with it. Very, very different approaches. And there are things that are in between, going from very rigorous form-based to performance, but somewhere in there is the range of possibilities.
So performance-based you're saying might say, look at the houses around you, and to the extent to which you comply with, that you fit within their context, you get more points.
That's right.
Than a house that's very different from the context.
That's right, and you lose points, and you just
Right.
say, and there's a minimum score.
Right.
So that doesn't necessarily, and then with best
Right.
practices,
Right.
you say, these are generally the things that we like.
Right.
We're not bashful.
Right.
We like these things, and these are the things we generally don't like. But if you want to try it, you're on your own,
Right.
and try it, and we'll see,
So let me try to understand. So let me just ask you a question. So could it be performance-based zoning would say, look, if you want to get a big house, you're going to have used up all your points, and now you're not gonna be able to build a pool house or a garage.
That's right.
Right?
That's exactly right.
So you
Exactly.
have so many points you can get, and it's up to you to how you use it, but you can't,
That's right.
you can never get 100, you can never get everything. So you
That's
have to
right.
decide which one you want.
I think
That's
that's
right.
really.
Would that also include the swimming pool and tennis
I
court?
know that's the
Oh,
question.
you can find
Right,
it, yeah.
right.
I don't know.
You know, it'd be also.
I
Well, that's
noticed that-
open, you know, that's what you call recreational space.
Yeah, it just depends on how you want to really
Right,
write this,
right,
but I think
right.
essentially Paul's explanation is a good one in terms of what it is that you have a bag of points, and you have and a whole bunch of criteria that we're going
Right,
to
right.
evaluate how well you perform in
Right.
advance,
Right.
and you get to use up all of your points, and it depends on how you want to do it. As long, but at the end of the day, you need to pass.
You could achieve that goal, for example, with lot coverage. You know, if you want to use all your lot coverage in your main house, great. If you want a pool house, you have to have a smaller house.
Exactly.
Right.
You're still, you're
Right,
still
right.
constrained within setbacks and things though, with performance.
No, you do that also within, when we did, in most of the performance zoning, there are some very basic rules which really have to do with rear yards.
That everyone has to
Right.
follow.
That everybody has to do that.
That's a
You know,
standard.
side yards,
Right.
in part because this is already a continuing expectation,
Right.
that there's going to be a certain minimum distance between my house and somebody else's, and between the rear of my
Right.
house and
Right.
somebody else, and so on. So, no, I think those, but the front yards are much more variable unless it's been a planned community, and that's where you really want to begin to pay attention to.
It's interesting because one of the, I think, the criticisms we've heard of our current zoning, which is somewhat form-based, it started to get more form-based, is, you know, everyone's forced into sort of the same jacket, if you will. And so houses look the same over and over again, whether they're on Halsey Street or Tulsa Lane or Wyandanch. They end up looking the same because everyone's fitting in the, you know, everyone's first of all, everybody maxes out the envelope now.
Of course.
That's by definition.
Right.
And so everyone ends up with more or less the same answers, or two or three answers
Yes,
that
right.
they've learned can work in the zoning. And one of the, not as much on Post Crossing, but certainly on a lot of village streets, like on my street, there's a lot of variation. Some houses are close to the street, some houses are far away from the street, and that's part of the context of that street. One of the things I see, for example, Little Plains now is every house is the same amount, is exactly the same. Every house being built is exactly
Actually, Paul, that's a great
the
point.
same amount back, the same front driveway. It's almost like it's
So-
become the new cookie cutter.
I mean, the way performance would work, it would
Right.
say, really pretty
Right.
much to paraphrase what you said, the quality of my street is that there's a lot of variation in the front yards, therefore, do not line your building up with any other building. There's no buildings on the block
Right.
line up, for example.
Unless you were on a street where every building line.
And then if you're on one that's very regular, then you don't want to be the
Right.
nail that
Right.
sticks out.
Right.
So it depends, you know, so as you
Yeah, it's a
characterize
review
them,
in
and you can
context.
talk about
Right.
building heights and roof things and so on, and each one of those becomes the basis of making it more location-specific, literally context-based.
Mhm.
What people seem to want.
It's the hard part of it is it's
But I think,
a more difficult thing for a building department to analyze than just street.
Well,
But it
I
isn't.
learned my lesson, having, in my youth, having written much more complicated regulations than I write now. And the lesson I learned over time was the building department. Boy, did they come up with stuff, you go, what? And so, first it has to be in plain English, two, it has to have lots of pictures, so that people understand what you really
Right,
mean,
right.
not just words. And then keep it as simple as possible. And one of my rules for writing regs is you start, if you had 5 things that you're going to do,
Right.
what are they? Because we could always come up with a list of 20, but keep it short, keep it sweet, and then really see whether, and then the other thing is, if you know how people design, it's what are the 5 things that would actually really pretty much lock this in? And that there are a bunch of other things which are secondary or tertiary. But, you know, there are tails that wag the dog. You make this decision and you've eliminated a whole bunch of other possibilities from happening. And I think that's one of, you know, what the way to begin to think about this.
and also the quantitative
Right.
The quantitative part is there are formulas.
Yes, oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
That's, well, that's just math.
Yes, and you could measure compliance.
Yes,
You
right.
know, it's, and then it's really,
And so it's
this is what
easy,
you
it's
do.
right there, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
It's
now-
actually, yeah.
What's with CAD now, because we were doing this by hand, which is a nightmare, to say the least. The reason I know a lot of this, I ended up being the consultant to actually interpret this stuff, and it was awful. But now with CAD, everybody can turn out this kind of, the evaluation that George was showing you, or evaluate their design. Most architects who have any brains do this right now anyway. They're evaluating what they're doing as they go along, they're figuring out the cost, they're looking,
Sure.
and they're visualizing it. So none of this, you know,
And they're all
20 years
using
ago.
Yeah,
SketchUp
you're not
or-
reinventing the
or-
wheel.
No,
Yeah.
not at all,
Or
no,
Revit
not at
or
all.
one of the
Now,
models.
see, I like this, because this is transferable to developers, architects, building departments, municipality departments.
Any other questions? Because we're gonna have
May I say something?
to. Of course.
Is it preferable to have buildings staggered in the front? And how many roads or street fronts do you have that would be available to do that? And thirdly, would you want people to change what they already did?
I think what he's saying is you would get points if you complied with the nature of the street. So if you were
With the
on
nature of the neighborhood.
Elms, probably not the right example. If you're on Post Crossing where most houses are pretty much lined up, you get points for being lined up. If you are on Tolson Lane, where our nature is houses are different, you get points for not being lined up. So it would
Yeah,
be
negative.
whatever the nature, right? That's really.
And it's really important that
Right.
you all find those,
Right.
Well, that's,
right? I mean,
Right,
that's
right.
just it. There is,
Definitions
it's
in terms.
bespoke for your community, right?
Different
It's,
sizes,
Correct.
based on the size, we have to. find
Yeah,
out
some of that we
setbacks
have,
vary. So
yeah,
we already
yeah.
have that based on, I mean, if all the lots are exactly the same, then all the houses are gonna line up. If the lots are not all
Yeah.
exactly the same, then the houses are.
Right.
yeah, that's the difference between form-based and performance-based, I think is what he.
But Little Plain's a good example where the zoning has definitely led to everything being very lined up. And one of the things I think that made it feel not as dense before was you had much more variation. I mean, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily, but it's interesting, if you look at Little Plains and new houses that have been built, they're either white or brown, and they basically all follow the same, I mean, it's astonishing, they all literally follow the same form. And you can go house after house after house after house
Yeah.
after house,
You
every
built by
single
the
one
same
that's been built. No, but we do also have a very small number of architects working together,
Yeah.
so that's part of the reason for that, obviously, is every architect has their style, but, so it's interesting. I think we're gonna have to, yes, and then I'm gonna have to
But
finish up.
also, I think that the issue about the protocol about these boards is a really big issue.
Right.
Because a lot of the things that have happened and the infighting, we need a way to deal with, for instance, the zoning board of appeals may approve something, and then it gets, after it's come out of the building department, where it may or may not have come out. And then it gets to this architectural review board, and it's at the end of the line, even though there were variances that perhaps should not have been granted, let's say, 8 feet on the side and a side yard variance in a place where there are, huge mansions, and then this thing is jammed in there. They got that through, and we really need help in having some kind of a protocol about how it moves from, or how we can stop having so many problems from the failure of different boards to look at the entire project. That might not be exactly right, but that's sort of it. That we have these things sort of get loose, and then it's happening, and then there can be litigation, there's enormous numbers of visits to the architectural review board. It causes terrible, and it's allowed some things to be built, I believe, that perhaps should not have been built or should have been adjusted in some way.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to end it there.
Okay.
Thank you. So, as I think you know, in 2007, we passed a revision of the residential zoning that had been in place since 1963, which started to move the zoning to more of a form-based approach, with GFA being the primary way that we were regulating houses in the smaller lots. And I would say, at least for the first few years, that seemed to be working fairly well. And then once the economy recovered from the recession, we started seeing much larger houses being built in the village than we had seen before in those areas. The trustees made a small step a few months ago in passing a law that had impact on the height of houses and further defined bedrooms to impact the amount of parking spots that would be required. However, at the time when they passed that law, we all agreed that that was a small step, but didn't cover the larger issue of how we analyze what's happening in the smaller lots. So we're looking now to do an analysis that would, I think, probably best be stated as come up with a number of houses that everyone likes on the small lots. You test those houses against the current zoning to see how they work, how the current zoning works or doesn't work. Look at some of the newer houses being built and see how they work and what's different about them. And then uses what I guess I would call a workshop approach to test various zoning methods that would figure out a way to make sure that houses being built are more appropriate to the context of the streets that they're on. So that's the RFP that we sent and you responded to. So I guess like to start with you explaining the approach you would use, and
Sure.
then we'll do a little bit of Q&A.
Sure, thanks very much. I'm here to talk about the NPMV. As you know, NPMV's been in the village for a while now, as consultants to multiple boards. Most recently, we performed that FEMA area study for massing and articulation and other issues as for building size. We're currently doing we're doing another contract right now, study with the village for their processes through the multiple boards and try to simplify things as well and make more predictable. So we have a pretty good understanding of all the troubles that all the boards have, of a lot of the comments that have come up over the last the year and a half or so through other studies, public perception, likes and dislikes, and looking at everything from a true planning approach. A planning approach is not an immediate approach. It's not a 5 or a 10-year plan. It's something that just helps, making the big directions that affect a community of 20 to 50 years going forward. Good policy and form-based code, brings us along that way. Long Island, as you know, was designed very kind of, this is where somebody decided to start their business, and then eventually that became an industrial district, or somebody decided to build a house there and that became a residential district. And then as we changed from being a farming-based economy to residential economy after World War II, it became very spot zoning, strip zoning, things like that. Form-based code is a great tool of figuring out on a much smaller focus, with a much smaller focus, what are the needs of particular streets, potentially the creation of layover districts that can help create and maintain a certain character of community that a certain street has developed over the years. Understand the nuances between the scale and use of certain streets against others. So we understood the kind of where the results would hopefully tease out opportunity for improvement on, and so when we approached this proposal, we looked at the fact that we would be getting a list from the Planning Commission of maybe, say 20 to 30. I put in about 23 to 28 homes or buildings that you'd provide to us. We would then do some research in the village, see what records that are here, whether it be surveys or building plans, things like that. We're planning that about 80% of the properties that we survey, we're actually going to physically go to the properties. Well, we will photograph everything anyway to make sure it matches what's on the plans, but also anything that there isn't, the records are. What we found from the last few studies is not everything is in the building department. So being able to provide good analysis just from records was definitely not there wasn't an opportunity to get, the right data. So we're planning on about 80% of those homes, we'd actually go there, we'd measure them out on the outside. If there isn't a survey available, we'll use Suffolk County GIS to try to place it onto the parcel or on the tax lot to get an approximate area. We would use some local GPS data or Google Earth and things like that to get the approximate elevation of the street in front, so we know where we are in approximation if the street is rising or falling, or from street to street is what's going on. And then we build massing models out of SketchUp, basically. SketchUp is a great tool that we can model anything. We won't get into the particulars of fenestration or stylizing the house particularly. We'd be looking to get all the mass of the building and try to be as accurate as possible with its overall height, and probably within a foot or so if we're able to get to the peak. And obviously rounding things off to the nearest foot, but at least we'll be able to get the data that we believe that the study is going to require as a baseline. So going through all the village records and what we can get from the field, then we'll take that, start putting into sheets of understanding what all that is as a baseline, and then start testing. Start looking at the current codes and some other tools that are used elsewhere in the village, maybe in other districts in the village, and start looking at 2 or 3 other opportunities of tools that are already used by design professionals and homeowners and the boards as a way of articulating the goals of the community vision. Test that, and then we'll see if there's opportunities to finer tune up the process.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you're using GIS, is it GIS?
GIS.
And let's say you didn't have access to any actual building permit records. What level of accuracy is that? If you just were to use that data?
It's plus or minus a foot. I mean, again, I don't think that there's anything that's going to come out is going to be the difference of a foot, generally speaking. I think that if we get down to a point where we're down to the difference of a foot, it might be worthy of walking around with the committee members and saying, okay, what type of information do we need here really to either push us one way or another? But from a community planning standpoint, it's de minimis.
Now, can you also overlay any of the Google Earth type of technology that has actual imagery of what these buildings are without having to go to
SketchUp
drawings?
That's what SketchUp is a product that actually plugs right into Google Earth.
So SketchUp, what does it actually do? Does it pull the actual three-dimensional?
It's three-dimensional modeling, yeah.
And it takes the data off of Google Earth and...
Well, I can insert it in.
You can insert it in.
I can insert it in. So when you see areas like, if you go into Google Earth and change the angle on it, and you see that the massing of streets in Manhattan, the massing of the buildings, that is people on their own time massing out the building in SketchUp and placing it in to their... That's all grassroots.
So for right now, for the Village of Southampton, because you have a pretty good idea what data is available, what data do we have without pulling every set of plans and picking the measurements? What data is there that exists?
I think the goal of this study, though, I don't think I'm going to get that data. I'm either going to have to get it from files or have to go and physically measure.
Kind of easily available.
There isn't anything, because the satellite telemetry and all that other stuff gives you stuff.
So you get more of a footprint, but you're not going to get anything.
Not necessarily I get the footprint. Well, from GIS, I'm going from tax records. So I know the basic footprint of the building on the tax lot.
Right.
Basics.
Yeah.
But I don't know from any of the satellite imagery, whether it be on an angle or Google Earth or whatever. What I don't know is whether the house has a large overhang or doesn't have a large overhang. I can then go into Street View and try to look at different things, but again, it's a lot of limitations. Yeah. So for me, instead of me messing around for 2 or 3 hours of trying to figure something out, I'd rather be in the field and try to knock out a certain amount of houses a day, massing it out. Then it's real data. Right. Nobody can say that's not accurate in a public forum. That's not how my house looks. That's not how it is, or anything like that. If a house has been altered since the plans, we'll catch that data too.
Can you take a series of pictures of a street facade, for example, and layer that against the GIS data?
GIS is only in plan view, though.
Right, but you could take take the plan view and you know where the
Approximate location is.
approximate location is, so you could extrapolate that there's a volume above that.
Sure.
Could you extrapolate a photograph over that just to see if it matches or? So I'm getting too.
I think, I don't know, but I don't know what that would prove to me.
Probably the last of these
Okay.
questions.
Yeah, but
Right.
but it's okay, I don't know if that's really gonna show anything. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if I have a three-dimensional model, that I know that I can go out there and I can say, absolute, this house is within a foot.
Right.
And I know where it is on the street, and if, let's say that one particular street is a focus, rather than one here, one there, one here, but let's say one street, you're looking to be that kind of that test. And we hit every house on that street, I can make a gray model of the 3D volumes across the street. I can get off of GIS and Google Earth, I can get the elevation, the approximate elevation above sea level, but then I can put them all in the same plane, and we can look at a streetscape. So we can look at setbacks and other things across a whole streetscape.
And I guess part of the question would be, so one of the things we want to do this time is basically bring in, obviously, these are all public meetings, but also bring in architects who regularly practice in the village.
It's a great idea.
The developers who build here, and have them in effect share with us, let them show how they would approach it, or how they do approach it.
It's a great
So
opportunity.
that they are part of the conversation, because one of the things we find is when the trustees get to the point of voting, what they're hearing from architects is, this is not allowing me to do,
Right.
create the aesthetic, choices that I need, or this zoning actually doesn't work in the field.
Right.
Right, we hear that a lot, like,
Right.
yeah, you write the zoning, but in fact, when you try to apply it,
Right.
you're always going for a variance on it
Right.
because it doesn't. So what we want to do this time is give them a chance, which is why we set it up in the process we did, a chance to have input through workshops along the way, and maybe you could talk about how you would do that, or,
Right. So I think actually that is great, because it kind of end runs
right,
once you get to the
Right.
process point of moving it into doctrine.
right, right.
So it shortcuts that, which is
Right,
great.
right.
Second is you're asking these people who, obviously they know the neighborhoods, they're hired for a job. Anytime somebody wants an FAR increase, they still are going to draw the drawings that their client wants anyway. So any way you look at it, I think there's nothing but good that can come out of it, because it also publicly tests the arguments.
Right, right.
If you have a problem, show up and invest some time into talking about your point. Where I think we're slightly different from other planning firms is because of, me and my aspect of the role, that we are architects as well. So it's not just from a straight up planning study. We understand, on how to make it work, and that we would not necessarily suggest solutions that force force architecture and forms that ultimately the planning is okay with. So broad brushing, understanding the nuances of all those shit. So from the workshop standpoint, I think that after we collect the data, after we have the current tools applied to those different issues, and what other there is, then we come up with a couple of different, again, taking that SketchUp model, and we'd say, okay, if you use this is what it does to the form. If you use this is what it does to the form. So, publicly speaking, anybody that wants to debate what it could happen, they'd see how it actually would affect those forms or not, or support. This is a project that we like, and we want to encourage this and support this. We don't want to hurt it this way. And it actually will, I think, speed up the process.
I mean, is there any way we could have an actual exercise with architects and we put a street plan out and sort of discuss, well, how would you site this house? I mean, do you think like that would be useful?
I think that once we have diagrams, for lack of a better term, it's almost like taking out sketch paper and you say, okay, but what if you do this and what if you do this? So once we have those models, and even if we put it up on the board or we put it here, whatever tools we decide how they want to participate, everybody's going to have to do some work prior to that meeting. We can figure out which are the ways that we can look at. Is there this is good, but if it was 5 feet back, it wouldn't be hit by this, tool or that tool. And then we'd take a quick look to say, well, does that make it that they can't have a pool, or they can't have a deck, or they can't have a accessory garage? Or does it? What are the collateral impacts that we don't want to hurt either?
Right,
So-
it'd be great if you could put it on an FTP site before the meeting, so an architect could come to the meeting and say, look, I looked at the drawings you did, and this is what I think the issue is.
Yeah,
Because I think it's sometimes hard for people to respond at a meeting.
Yeah.
They're trying to.
There has to be some prep.
Right.
There has to be some prep. And I think, though, is that whomever is going to also be involved, other firms that are in the neighborhood, they'd have to sign up previously.
Right.
And I wouldn't, and I don't know if whether it be FTP or we just issue them a disc saying,
Right.
here's all the tools, here's all the data.
Right.
And
You do it yourself with the house you would design, and does it work?
That's right. And we'll say,
We have competition.
and maybe we could pick out one or two.
Right.
Part of that teasing out of data and doing all those tests, we may be able to get down to, say, 3 to 5 sites that everybody scratches their head saying, is this the white elephant?
Right.
And are we going to make a rule based on the white elephant, or are we dealing with, let's say, make a rule that applies to the 95%? Because you are going to have that. And overlay districts and other qualifications will, you may have buildings that are so far into the corner, a corner lot,
Right.
that are so much part of the community character,
Right.
you wouldn't want them to change. And you wouldn't want somebody to do different. So you'd almost have to show a bonus to say, if you wanted to do this, if you have a unique scenario or corner, and we look at the street plane and look at all these other tools. An inline property may be different than a corner property, depending on the size of the lot. So we'd want to tease out all those opportunities so that the redevelopment and growth of the village,
Right.
you keep it.
One question, I think everybody mentioned the last, is that we were on the ARB board, you have second floor decks, either in the front, back, or side.
Right.
And I think these should be addressed because they affect the privacy of the neighbors all around.
Okay.
We did not approve front decks.
Just so I can understand that. So when you say second floor decks, are you talking about also Juliet balconies?
Yes.
Any opportunity of opening up a door and looking or walking out, or both?
Yes, both.
Both. There are certain style homes that, let's say, the old, kind of like the plantation style homes that have those.
Gallery.
Yep. They could just be a style of home that is not allowed in a certain district, and maybe there are areas that are. Now, when you have homes that are on business districts that are in those areas, those walkable neighborhoods, actually front decks and, even second floor ones, if appropriately done, are actually good from a security standpoint.
Right.
Eyes on the street type of aspect of community planning. So I think that one of those things to look at in the study would be, is it something that should uniformly be not allowed?
Right.
Or if it is, here's 20 things that have to be checked off in order for it to be applicable. So it's not just thrown out there because somebody wants to look out from their bedroom with French doors and a Juliet balcony. It's not the need of the inside. It's more that because it affects form. It affects privacy, things like that. I know that from prior studies, specifically when their side yard variance is given, is when what is being seen from the side of a house, side decks, side balconies, things like that. That really can be, second floor can really loom over the neighbor.
Do you think the schedule we've outlined is achievable?
It depends.
Okay.
It's a little tight.
Okay.
It's a little tight, and I'm glad that you guys scheduled this as quickly as you did.
Right.
It's a little tight. It depends on the access to the information. That's why I planned on that 80% of it was going to be field work, and I'm not worried about,
Good. Because one of my concerns is, since I think one of our views is that we're going to use some of the older houses that everyone likes as models, building department may not have full files on those houses, because if they haven't applied recently, the house was built in 1910, whether or not they have a complete file,
right.
Who knows, right?
That's right.
And whether it's accurate at this point, that's the other problem.
Yeah,
They may have a file, but it doesn't really reflect where the house is now.
Right.
I think
Do you already have a list together?
No, not yet. Not yet. I think there is a fairly good consensus. I think if I were to put it in shorthand, but it really is shorthand, it won't be just this. It would be houses on Post Crossing and Elm Street, which are the classic old houses, classic streets that everyone loves and have great context to them. And I think one of the things that's come up in these hearings, and it is I think troubles us because it makes it very hard to have the conversation, is, I think I said, maybe I'm repeating what I said 10 minutes ago, but half the room says you could never build that house under the current zoning, and the other half the room says, every house being built is bigger than those houses.
Right.
So we're trying to understand literally, first of all, could you replicate what we like? And so one of the things that's also, I think, hard to understand from our point of view is when people say houses are too big, that's sort of like talking about climate change. It covers a very wide range of issues, right? And do they really mean that there's a house and a pool house and a garage and a pool and everything else, and therefore the lot's full, and that's what they as a neighbor are
straight up
perceiving?
square footage, or
is it literally just the house?
Right.
So that, when you listen to people, very often they'll start out with the house is too big, and then they start talking about the pool house and the garage and everything else. So part of what we're trying to understand is what is it, and so I think one of the things that's occurred to us sometimes is, do people love Post Crossing, for example, because that is a street that is really, was built with very large houses on lots that were otherwise basically open.
Right.
And so the houses, while big, didn't feel overwhelming, or is it literally the house size?
Right.
And that may vary from street to street also, but what we're trying to, part of what we want to do is define the issue first.
Yeah.
Because I think it's hard to solve an issue when people, I think, are a little bit talking past each other what the issue is.
Yeah, I think what came out of, I think we had proven during those other, that first study that we did, the perception of size of house isn't always how big the house is. It's not about square footage, it's not about FAR. It's often the amount of other fat that's on a building that doesn't go against FAR. It's often how the house presents to the street. Is it uphill a little, or is there a reason why it has to be raised? It could be the size of the planes and the articulation of the planes. So there's all these different pieces that could make somebody feel. It could be that a house that is in the middle of a 200-foot wide lot that has a 40-foot plane and a 50-foot plane doesn't seem as big, but when it's 15 feet from the property line, it seems as monstrous. So remembering where the vantage point, knowing where that viewpoint is, in understanding what those issues are. But going backwards to what you said, back to what you said originally about the old homes, often when you're doing studies on old areas and you're utilizing the newer codes, and people say you can't build that. Often that's true. And the reason why it's true is that the reason why the new codes are intact or have been adopted is because somebody took that same opportunity and did something really poorly with it. So it's not as much about the what were the rules. It's just that they exploited some things in there, and they didn't get checked, or they didn't get held back, or whatever the case may be. Or they were just, poor designer, or the house or the materials on the house didn't wear and tear to the weather, and it fell apart too fast. I mean, there could be so many reasons why the house became a house that didn't have the same reverence as something that was. Now, the other piece is, when something is in a neighborhood for decades, if not 100 years, it's the fabric. It's this. It's like the difference between somebody moving in next door to a sod farm elsewhere on Long Island, and that's all they're used to seeing. They think they have 200 acres of backyard grass to not enjoy but to view on, and then somebody wants to put solar panels there. It's different, so they're going to come out against it. If there was trees there and somebody wanted to put a sod farm, they'd be against it. So people are against change. And it's trying to break those issues down to, that they have to understand that fine-tuning doesn't mean it's a small house.
Right.
It just means that the house is going to encourage better design, better behavior. You'll still get your square footages, so the property values are there. It's well tested that property values maintain an increase in down streets that are historic or more traditional in nature. When the houses are more homogeneous, complementary, not the same, not cookie cutter, but more that it's all of similar form, and they present similarly, that neighborhood has a higher value. Because that sense of community and that perception, tree-lined streets sell better than houses, streets that are neutered of trees. So there's all these different pieces that have to be looked at to understand the perception of why those streets might be successful. And it might be that the house can be built, it just may not be able to built 5 feet off the property line. Because of all the takings over the years too.
The other thing we're trying to understand, so, I always think of those historic photos of Southampton where, you see when the estate section was built and there's no trees and no bush because they were all built on farm fields. And I always think if you tried to build those houses today, you would get thrown out of town because they look enormous.
That's right.
We see them today and they're surrounded by, trees that are taller than the house
Tons
and
of
huge
character.
hedges and everything else, and we think, oh, what, these are gorgeous houses. They knew so much better
That's right.
how to build a house in those days.
Right.
So a little bit is trying to understand the facts so that we can separate out, because again, you build a new house on a street and it starts out with small hedges and small trees. It almost by definition is going to look bigger at the start. And so what we're trying to understand a little bit of how much of this is people responding to change and houses being built versus houses that truly are bigger than what we've seen before. And again, that's where facts would be really helpful, because I think when we get to the trustees, part of the problem for the trustees is it's very hard for them to differentiate between what people's emotions are and the facts.
Yeah.
So we really want to get there with the facts, and then they can make the policy.
That's part of what I liked about this RFP was that first phase of the fact finding, that it's not a broad brushing, photographing, and then it's opinion. It's let's spend the time on making a model so everybody can point to it and say, this is an absolute.
Regarding,
I just want to mention what Paul had mentioned on the Post Crossing. Those houses were built, turn of the century, had horse and buggy, 1 car.
Mm-hmm.
The attic was unfinished, the basement was unfinished, 3, maybe 4 bedrooms. Now these houses, the attic's finished, 2 bedrooms up there, basement's finished, 2 more. Now you got 7-bedroom house and 2 parking spaces. That creates a problem.
Right. A lot of communities have this problem, particularly the villages all over Long Island that don't allow parking on the street at night. I mean, this is a Suffolk issue, this is a Nassau issue, this is a Westchester issue.
I don't want to see us having no parking signs all over. I hate those signs.
It's clutter. That's as much as clutter as there is, any other type of, people leaving their cars out overnight is clutter. So, understanding those issues, or even that there's an overlay district, maybe, some of those tools come in, because you're not going to change the house. Some of the tools in the future, when somebody comes in, they want to finish their basement. If they don't have, then they don't get a permit for more bedrooms. I mean, there's other ways that go through, you're in a district that is unique, like a lot of the Long Island downtown villages, that there isn't parking. And the response to those areas is usually municipal lots and stuff like that, which may or not work in that neighborhood. But again, you try to do your planning based upon your middle percentile. Try to cast the widest net, get the intent there, and then fine tune, and also offer up, for lack of a term, bonuses. Small, not real occupiable bonuses that help break the plane on the street, whether it be a small 1-story vestibule on the front or the side, larger eaves, things like that. And then all of those things can work into the overlay districts that fit into specific massing requirements.
I mean, one thing that's very striking now, if you look at various streets like Little Plains, every house that's being built literally is like a block. They fill out like every, it's almost, it really becomes a, 4 square because they're filling out every inch. And so when you go down the street, there's less and less variation over time because every house is doing the same thing. Where if you went to Post Crossing, you'd see some houses have a porch on the 2nd floor, some houses have, a porch on the 3rd floor. I mean, it's much more varied.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the reasons why what is a fairly dense street doesn't feel as dense.
That's right. There's a lot of breaks and planes.
And I think it's one of the things we're very interested in is trying to figure out some data points and some facts. But as I think about it, there's some quantitative facts and there's some qualitative facts.
Agreed.
The quantitative is like, well, what's the average site lot existing? Well, you could measure that. But then qualitatively, I was thinking I've been through these seminars for Project for Public Spaces. I don't know if you know
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And they have this method, which I'm sure other people use, where they'll take a group and they'll go to a space, and you'll spend a half an hour or an hour observing, and you get people to check with a checklist, like, what do you enjoy most about the space? And you start looking, and you'll see,
Yeah.
well, it's the fact that it's got shingles, or that it's got a high-peaked roof, or whatever these elements might be. Because
Yeah.
I feel like in the normal process, people just have an immediate reaction, but if you stop and think and look at a lot,
Yeah.
you can start to maybe pick out those things that are objectionable or that are.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that, and that was something I think we brought up in our FEMA study, was the qualitative items, that was, subtle to everybody else, or you don't pick it up on a black and white drawing. You don't realize that this plane is 15 feet back from the other plane, and you know what that actually feels like. You know that how many feet from here to here is, and when does something feel too big? When does something?
That part of it's a little more difficult in a process, and I'm not sure
I think
if there's
that
any
gets-
interesting tools we could use to kind of pick up some of those.
I think that if after we get that feedback from the community designers and stuff like that, if we find that there is one of the things, just to step back, part of that methodology is actually getting everybody just on the same sheet of paper on how to articulate their view. So it's not as much of a rating system. It's actually trying to get everybody on the same page. So when somebody says that something feels uncomfortable, they can say why. Why is it that a one style bulb, 2700K bulb feels different than a 3000K bulb? People just say one's bright, one gets into my eyes, why doesn't? If you explain it, then they're going to go, okay, now I get it. Now I can make better choices. Now the information you want from me, I can give you feedback on it. So part of that is largely educational, and getting everybody to use this similar vernacular and realize what they're really seeing. What's offensive, and why is it offensive? Is it offensive because of the color? Is it offensive because there's no planting? Is it offensive because the house is beautiful, it's just too close to the street? And the reason why it might be too close to the street is the street might have been over there, and then the street was widened over time. And it used to not be there. It used to have a 20-foot front yard, and now it has 5. So I think the tools to circle back is if it is needed, it'd be something that would happen after the workshop, because the people, you're going to know at that point which people are understanding it and which people don't, and then maybe we could figure out a walkabout
There was
way
also,
of doing that.
I worked on Better Park City plan,
Right.
point for city planning, and there was an architect named Gary Hack. I don't know if you've ever ran across him. He was an MIT planner, and he, as I remember, this was like 15 years ago. He had a very interesting method where he took pictures. It was park planning, so it wasn't house planning. But he'd take pictures and he'd show a beautiful green park with a bench, and then he'd show a basketball court. And by showing images, he would elicit response and try to build consensus.
Right.
Which was easier to do in an image than it was actually with a plan. People
That's
could
correct.
Read a plan.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I don't know if to some degree we might want to just have large-scale photographs of homes, typical homes, so people could say, well, I hate that. And, well, is it because you don't like white clapboard, or is it because you?
The danger in that is people will tend to feel very picked out of the crowd, and they'll defend their home, or they'll defend their friend, and you'll get data that
These
isn't
are actual
helpful.
houses that people live in.
That's true.
Right. Right. That's kind of my point. Actually,
You almost would have to, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. You don't know where this house is,
Right.
so that actually, is a
Right,
better
to take it
tool.
out of the context of the street and say
Bingo.
what it is about this house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions, because we're gonna
One other
need, we have
question that
five
one of our board
more
members
minutes.
who's not here
Right.
mentioned about the backyards where they put swimming pools,
Right.
pool houses, patios, and there's no lawn left.
Right.
I mean, there
Yeah.
should be some type of ratio worked out that they're gonna have to leave so much open lawn.
Well, I think you have already 2 of the 3 tools already on the books. You have obviously FAR and what's in there, and then you have lot coverage.
Right.
But you can also factor in impervious
Right.
lot coverage requirement as well for the rear yard.
I think, how should I put it, our lot coverage probably needs to be examined again in terms of people have found ways to
Get around it.
stretch the definitions, maybe is the right way to put it.
Yeah.
So that you end up, even though there is theoretically a lot coverage,
Mm-hmm.
people find ways to cover more of the lot.
Yeah,
For
I think
gravel is treated differently than
It should be.
paved, which it should be. But on the other hand, if you're the neighbor, gravel still does mean it's not a plan. So
Yeah,
that's
well,
the sort of
that's
issue
where
that make it hard.
yeah, in some other villages, we've actually helped with that definition. If
Right.
it doesn't grow,
Right.
it goes into impervious, regardless of the coefficient of runoff. It's a total separate issue. How stormwater is handled
Right.
and coefficient runoff is a completely different animal than something that grows.
Okay, any last question? Yes?
Okay. I was just wondering, I don't know if you've already done this, but have you gotten together with the ZBA, the ARB, and the planning board to have a real in-depth discussion on what their problems really are, and make a list and compile them, and play that against, you're gonna have some kind of an open hearing on all of this at some time?
It's a very good point. We actually, this process started with the ARB, because they came to us and said, you know, the problem is that all these laws get passed, and then we're hearing from the architects and the developers that they can't really apply them, and the building department doesn't seem to understand how they work, and this really started out, I think, more as their idea, actually. Could we take a very practical approach so that in the next round, we come up with something that the architects and builders, whether they support it or not, understand it and understand how it works. So
But
yes.
Don't put it in words.
Correct.
And have it in front of you and
Right.
available
We agree.
to play against these
Yeah,
different
yeah.
scenarios. You're never gonna get.
Yeah, and it certainly is our intent, and we will be, including the ARB,
Yeah.
in this process,
And
because
gravel can be
they're the ones
terrible
that
if
get
you're
it.
the next door neighbor and somebody's driving in and out of it at
Right,
night or
right.
something like that.
Right.
And I was just wondering one other thing. Attics and cellars, why aren't they treated like living space like everything else?
Because they're not.
Yeah, well,
It's particularly in a cellar that could be a fire hazard for people.
I think we're mixing a few different things at once. There is now a much tighter definition of bedrooms than there was. So many of the things that have been built were built before that happened. But I think that is part of what's going to be looked at, is because an attic is, so I think there's two separate issues here. One is whether it's floor area, but the other is whether it's floor area or not, how
Living
that's,
space.
well, let me put it a little differently, how that size impacts the feeling of the house on the lot.
Yeah.
Or the number of people living there.
Right.
Well, part of what I was saying in the very beginning is you could have a home that's approved to be
Right.
6,000 square feet, but because of all the other fat that is on a
Right.
building, which is, you know, that they put super steep roofs on there, and that you have all this extra attic space and things
Right.
that may not be triggered into FAR,
Right.
it looks now like an 8,000 square foot home.
Right.
So that, you know, there's other, that you can either legislate it from the
Right.
outside, which
Right.
is sky planes and articulated
Right,
planes and
right,
things
right.
like that, which is good. That's all form-based
Right.
stuff. On the inside, you could say if you have an attic space, that the head height is this, or if it's over a certain percentage, or,
And we had that.
yeah, but it has to be fine-tuned even more.
Yeah.
So that somebody doesn't just cut collar ties, and now they have another room.
And it's not applied to basement.
One of the things I'd like to
We're
recommend,
gonna have to finish.
all right, finish it, is to change the rules, have the ARB review the stuff before everybody else
Right,
does.
right, right.
Right, but that would be something when we get into implementation.
When I was on the board, we ran into a situation like that.
Process needs to be investigated.
Okay,
Agreed. All right,
thank you very much.
Thank you. If you have any questions, give us a holler, of course.
Thank you for coming. The Village of Southampton, the Planning Commission in 2007 did a revision of the zoning code for the residential districts that have small lots. And that had been the first revision of the zoning code, I think, since 1963. And it began to move the village to what was more of a form-based zoning, with rules about setbacks and rear yards and front yards and where the garage should be, and most importantly, it was the first time we applied GFA to the lots rather than using the district as a way of regulating size. And I would say in the early period, it seemed to us that new zoning was generally working. We were seeing nicer houses than we had seen, and they seemed to be fitting in the context. Once the economy came out of the recession and building started to really get going again in Southampton Village, I think what we've seen more recently is much larger houses than we contemplated could have been built under the zoning, proving that we have a lot of very smart people working in the village who can figure out everything they can figure out. And we've taken the planning commission has done some studies, and the trustees have taken some small steps to at least start to address those issues, including both further regulating the height of houses in the districts, as you've seen, and further defining bedrooms to limit the amount of parking lots. But we think the next step, and we met with the ARB because while we are an advisory commission, in many ways the board that's on the front line of this is the Architectural Review Board, which sees every house almost in the village, and finds that the tools they have don't really give them the amount of support and analysis they think they need. So we all thought it would be good at this point to do a very practical approach, and the thought behind it, and what we'd like to hear how you would go about it. And I know you have some good experience in the East End to doing it. Is to look at some of the older houses that there seems to be fairly good consensus in the village are good in terms of how they relate to the street and to their context. Test them against the current zoning to find out if you could actually build them under the current zoning, because one of the things we hear all the time in hearings is, God, you could never build Elm Street again, or you could never build Post Crossing again. I have no idea whether that's true, nor do I think most of the people who say that actually. So it'd be nice to know if it were true. And then take that and say, now let's look at the new houses and let's try to understand what's happening. And then test various zoning concepts. And what we'd like to do, I think, which is maybe a little different than in the past, is not only invite the public to come to all our meetings as they do, but also try to figure out a way to work in a workshop context with the architects and developers who work in the village, so that they can be involved as we try to test. Because one of the things we hear a lot is, you pass zoning, but then it's very hard for me to work with, or you force me to do X or Y, and that's not what I'd like to do, and I don't think I'm getting as nice a house as I would. So we'd like to come up with something where, while the trustees will have to make the ultimate policy choices, we can at least advise them on what the facts are, and come up with something that I think at least everyone in the room can agree, these are what the facts are. We might come to different answers based on the fact. So that's the approach. Like to first hear from you how you would approach things, and then we'll have a little Q&A.
Sure.
And please introduce yourself, sorry.
Okay. My name is Glennis Berry. I'm an architect, a planner, and an urban designer. I started New York City's pedestrian and traffic calming program when nobody wanted it. So I understand totally how to look at existing conditions, analyze what's wrong, and then introduce new concepts and test them, and work with the people who are against the idea, because you often find out why, and then you can solve both at the same time. So I've had quite a bit of experience doing that. I've also been on the Suffolk County Planning Commission. I was one of the people reviewing the comp plan that just came out, so I worked pretty intensely on that. And I've been on different review committees, including form-based programs. And I'm an advisor to the Planning Commission in Greenport, where I look at proposals and analyze them for the commission. So, and I'm an architect, so I look at it from both sides on how you regulate to protect the larger good, and also to give as much freedom so that individuals can have their own expression within context. How I would approach this, one, you have done one of the best plans I've seen, actually. I love the one that you did for the commercial area. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, it's sort of the way I would approach it, because your cue is what's there. This is your community, and it's something you obviously love. So understanding what is there, and sometimes it's not what you think, until you really examine it. For instance, in Orient, everybody likes sidewalks. Well, when you started analyzing it, there was only a sidewalk on one side, and the streets were not symmetrical. So, really understand what's there. Analyze, I would photograph, I would analyze all the spatial concepts, it's not only lot coverage and size of lot, but it's also proportion, and it's how the proportion relates from one to another. Like in Orient, you could have a house that was 3 times the size beside one that was smaller, and they looked okay, because there was a proportion to the front street facade that wasn't compatible to another. So there are ways at really understanding your context. I personally am very involved with environmental conditions, and stormwater runoff is one. So a lot of places don't have impermeable coverage as well. And that's part of your community. It's not only does it absorb the rainwater so it protects the public area and also the pollutants, but it creates a sense of greenery that defines a town. And looking at the details, for instance, how do people deal with their boundaries has a huge impact on community culture and how the whole context fits together. And people don't think about that. Often it's not regulated. And you suddenly find there's a new aesthetic that's moved in and taken over a whole street, and it totally degrades. How you plant trees can also have an impact. So it's size, volume, lot coverage. You may be able to have the same volume, but you break down the form, or you even have, like, some codes prefer one big building, but if you had a cottage with, you know, one of the bedrooms in it, the scale of the buildings comes down, you know, if you're looking at the overall impact. So depending on the street, also, like today with Greenport, we were looking at 2 subdivisions, just simple lot subdivisions. And the thing that people forget is, oh yes, you know, there are a lot of lots in the town that are this width. It's non-conforming, but, you know, they're existing. But it was a house that was close to the main road, had a much bigger house on it. And that side lawn gave it a break from the smaller homes that made it livable.
Mhm.
And if you build on that, it's always going to be in shadow, and it's going to have this hulk over it. So it's about balance and trying to understand that. So. And then also, one is regulations, one is what's there, and one is what people want.
Mhm.
You know, so that's where it's important to find out what the vision is. And visions can change, you know, so is it going in a different direction and why? And then how do you create that compatibility? So, and I threw a few images up, just don't think that what I do for you is going to look like this, but I just wanted to give you some idea. These are the I put the very first pedestrian program in the country together, and got the very first grant from the feds. So we started from scratch, and we looked at pedestrians as a form of transportation, and then we looked at the space that people had to walk in and what they were comfortable walking in, and we looked at safety. And that was how I was able to get it accepted, because I viewed it in the same way you looked at a car, and we reduced accidents by 50% while we were looking at aesthetic, contextual solutions. This is what we did in Orient, and this was an example where on Village Lane, the historic lane, you could not build to the same direction, the same regulations. You cannot replicate this community. So we analyzed, you know, some basic parameters, and we also asked people what they cared about. So the streets, the fact that they can own the street, that the traffic is slow, farmland and views of the farmland, the sea and feeling a connection to the sea. So views were important, and a sense of being in proximity. So we looked at the zoning and compared to the existing, and as you can see, there's a big difference, like usually half.
What did that, what did that show us?
Well, the left was the existing size of lots, what was the median width, And then we looked at what zoning would be. So if somebody wanted to create a historic street compatible with the village, they wouldn't be able to do it. It looks more suburban in nature. And we also looked at how development occurred. And historically, it was along streets with open space in between. And now it's more infill. And you can see those lines in the middle of the field. That's how people are starting to develop it, even when they cluster the development. They're still not thinking in terms of streets, they're thinking in terms of area. So, you know, the things that this town valued were the small lots surrounded by the large tracts, the narrow streets, street trees, sidewalks, shallow building setbacks with layered details, no garages or they're behind the house. And there was a 3 to 5 window front facade with expansions either set back or behind. So there was a compatibility in the village. And then we looked at boundaries and how people treated boundaries. I don't have a picture of one, but one had hedges that went up like 30 feet. So you couldn't see the views at all. You know, and everybody wanted human scale zoning, streetscapes that supported that. And they didn't want new building design or guidelines to mandate style or design. They should be measurable and objective and applied equally to people. So they should be as general as possible while still supporting local character. And we came up with the idea that we really needed 3 kinds of zoning. These are all in the same community. The top one is the village. The middle one is 2 existing zoning. It has the same zoning as the village. And then the bottom is rural, where people like, you know, the larger lots, but they also like the narrower streets than are required by code. We looked at Hell's, this is an older project. We were one of 15 architectural firms to look at Hell's Kitchen South in New York and come up with ideas of improving the area. And we came up with a series of trails that had different themes. One was topography, one was pocket parks to connect people to green, and another was opening up views because it was near the tunnel entrance, so you were always blocked by a wall. So we opened up some of the views and used that as a feature. And then, you know, just analyzing different kinds of organization of space. We usually start with hand sketches, and it can be playful or serious, but it's amazing how just the way you connect simple forms really creates a variety of space. So we tend to really look at that and explore. We like vernacular architecture and really understanding what works. And we do also 3D modeling, so we can come up with concepts and test them. That's it.
So tell us, what are your thoughts of how you would create an inventory? Would you do it through photos, through building department records, through your own going out in the field, all the above, or?
All of the above.
Okay.
I don't know what you have, but I know some towns have the lot lines over the aerial view.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would start there just to get a sense of where things are. And, you know, I would go walk the streets. I'd photograph the streets. I'd research the code and then start saying, try and understand what is conforming to code and what's not conforming to code.
Mm-hmm.
And then what is appealing and what isn't appealing and what makes that so. So I would start there and then sort of pull in some of the environmental and space-making concepts.
And have you worked before in a context where you have local architects come in and participate in the process?
Well, not exactly.
Okay.
Well, actually, what we did in Hell's Kitchen,
Uh-huh.
where we had the 15 architectural firms
Right.
was fabulous because we had our own charrette where we met together and we criticized each other's ideas.
Right.
And that was the most valuable aspect.
I think that's a little bit what we want to do here. We want the architect who works in the village to say to us,
Yes.
I think that makes no sense.
Right.
I can't get the house every one of my clients wants me to do.
Yes.
We want to hear that now,
Yes.
so that we don't hear it afterwards, right?
Right, no,
Right.
no, so,
Right.
so that was actually one of our
Right.
most valuable, and
Right.
it was great.
Uh-huh.
Because also, everybody was on the same footing.
Mhm.
Everybody had thought about,
Right.
because there's a difference when you really study something, or when you see it for the first time and make a few comments.
Right, so this is getting everything out before the meeting, so that people
Right.
had a chance to
Yes.
look and think
And,
about
and
it.
they had tried to come up with
Right.
ideas themselves.
Right.
So they really knew what they were talking about,
Mhm.
and it was very enriching. And for all of us, I think.
Right.
So, yes, and I think the preparation is important. So maybe not just coming to see I would have my own presentation, but I would ask them and give them an assignment too.
Right,
And maybe
right.
they can all present what
Right.
they think are the key things.
Right.
So that they're
Right.
part of that,
It's a very good idea.
so.
Right.
And also maybe consulting with the building department.
Absolutely, yep, they
Yeah.
know better than anybody.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that, looking back on it that's hard is we can pass a law, but if the building department doesn't think they really know how to apply it, or they have a different, let me put it differently, they have a different view of how to apply it.
Right.
That's often the problem. So we think, we pass something, we think we've thought about it. The building department looks at it and their interpretation of what it says is slightly different.
Yes.
So we'd like to sort of deal with that up front, so bring them into the process
Right.
early. So they can say, gee, or maybe they say, look, I'm looking at this, is this too complicated? Right? I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
you're asking me to do too many things, given the volume of applications I have. That's really helpful to hear before we start the process, rather than later on.
And I did take the training to be a code enforcement officer years ago, so
Right.
I understand the code and their point of view.
Mhm.
And actually in Greenport, it's been really fun because the building inspector is much looser than I am. And so we will look at something together
Right.
and talk about it. And I think we both get a little closer to each other on the issues by doing that. Because you do want to allow people to take ownership of their property. You do want them, to feel invested in the community and allow creativity to occur.
In the example of Orient that you showed us, I guess you went through a process and you identified
Mhm.
aspects that people agreed that they liked. How did that get interpreted into any kind of,
It's not in code yet,
it's not in code?
no.
How do they anticipate doing that?
The town is doing a comprehensive plan, and they're taking one chapter at a time, and they're doing it in-house. So it's taking a long time. And they're just getting to the zoning. So right now, they're identifying all the existing zoning in the communities, and the next step is going to be looking at any needs for change in zoning. So Orient, as a community, I started this without a directive because I knew it was coming and I thought it was a big issue. And now the community is coming up with their own visioning of what the plan should be, so that they can help direct the town on this. Because each of the hamlets is different and they don't want the same regulations on each hamlet.
Mhm.
So
Interesting.
Orient is trying to define itself and see if it can.
That's town of Southold?
Yes.
Southhold.
Right, so Southold, basically, they're gonna create a town zoning that is actually differentiated for each hamlet.
Well,
Or
no.
a matrix, I guess,
Yeah,
between the two.
They
Right.
will have hamlet zoning,
Right,
and then the question is,
Right.
can each hamlet
Right.
fit into that zoning, or does there need to be variety in
right.
Is Michael Collins working on this project? He's a town engineer.
He's a
over
town
there.
engineer, it's more the planning department. I don't know, he tends to, I deal with him a lot on the wastewater issues, because we started a nonprofit to change decentralized
I've
wastewater.
known Michael since he was about,
Yeah. So I know he's very involved with the water quality issues.
yes.
So. And I'm sure he reviews things, so. But it's the planning department that's the lead on it.
Okay.
When you look at our time frame, does it look realistic to you?
Personally, for me, I can't start till like end of November,
Okay.
December.
Okay.
So a lot of the schedule depends on feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Because I find I can work intensely, but if I need feedback on something or to go to the next step, and especially when you're working with a board or working with somebody, it can take 1 to 2 months to get that answer.
Right, right.
So you have to allow time for that.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing, because it allows people to think and talk and,
Right.
you know, so I think you're gonna need time in between the tasks and the phases.
Right, right. Whereas the tasks can't come one after another in rapid order because people won't have enough chance to
Right.
think it through and buy in, I guess.
Right. And then the
Issue.
other thing is just
Right.
access to information.
Uh-huh.
You know, if it's
Right.
easy, then we have it, and
Assume it's not.
sometimes it's not.
Right.
So those are the two main things that slow a project down.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
It's funny, I don't think I've ever been in the village streets at Orient. I've
Oh,
never
it's
seen that
beautiful.
before.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the main road, so I guess you don't see that,
Heard
but
about
Yeah, it's
it's
Bering
gorgeous,
Electrical
absolutely
Line.
gorgeous.
It's an
Did you see one of her
amazing
points
community.
about-
Oh,
Yeah.
very, that's been my
I know, that's
contention
your-
for
that's your
years.
baby, that's your baby, I know.
Uh-huh, I can see why.
And
Nobody wants to do it.
I've always been impressed
Well,
with them.
I think I know the
Takes
ferry
a
more than anything
will,
else in Orient.
the power
Yeah.
of
That's
the-
my major knowledge
No,
of Orient.
you really
They
need
can
to take
do-
Yeah, obviously.
that ride
Then
down.
they
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
then they
And
can
it's
do-
really
All- all
interesting,
they
the new
have to
streets
do
look
is
like
hire
suburbia.
Electrical
Yeah.
engineering
Yeah,
know?
it's a
with
shame.
PSC&G, and you grid the whole damn
I
village
know,
out.
it's a shame in the village
The
because,
village does a
you know,
road work.
Wickabog
Yes.
Road, which was
Then
all
You
Fall
bury the
starts
convent, you bury
Like you knew
the
it was gonna be
boxes.
developed.
No, why, just bury the
But it
stuff in
was
the
such a
ground.
lost opportunity
Right,
because
really,
it
just
got developed
start.
basically as a
Just start,
suburban
and start doing
Yeah.
the whole darn
place
road.
where it could have been
Absolutely.
developed and
Then
be more
when
like
you
the
get
existing
ready to
village.
do it,
I mean,
you
Old Town, in
pick a
fact,
street,
is
one street at a
infinitely
time.
better
You
than
give
anything else that was done on
homeowners in
Wickabog
incentive so
Road.
much off your village
Yeah, like
tax.
they did with natural gas. You know,
Linus,
what they did, you know, with
just, I'm
gas
sorry.
lines.
Yeah.
Do you also,
You know,
are you
same thing,
capable of
right?
writing
Yeah, but
zoning text?
People buy into it.
It's the
I
other thing
think
we
so.
brought to
I
me.
mean, I've been writing for Greenport. I've
This is
been
why I asked when I said
drafting their
about the village having a parking
resolutions.
garage.
Right.
Well, geez,
So
I said, I brought
what
that
I
parking
did
garage
is,
up from Moon
I
Reagan,
hadn't
we
done
got
it
our heads
before,
chopped off.
so I looked at a whole bunch of samples,
Right.
and I actually improved upon what they were doing, but
I've
it
seen
doesn't mean
parking
I'm an
garages. I've
expert.
seen them up
I'm
in
just
Connecticut.
looking
And
and
they don't look
trying to
like
figure it
New York
out, and I
City's
hope the
got
lawyer would
terrible
look it
parking
over.
garages. They
Right.
look like
You
wood
know,
concrete.
so I'm happy to
Ugly as like a
work
damn-
Right.
with
Down in
somebody,
Florida,
but I don't
walked-
claim to.
Moon was the first one to bring it up, and of course, I was negative again, until I saw the first parking garage. Oh, I've been walking past it for years and realized it was a parking garage.
Right,
What's the other
yeah.
one called?
And I took photographs of it, and I saw some others down there.
Performance-based.
And they designed so you don't know they're parking garages.
Oh, it's funny that you
A
said
little
that,
bit.
because I saw.
I think some of
you
the
were
form
driving
base goes
upstate
too far.
and you were going on Henry.
I was on the committee for CR 39,
Uh-huh.
and I did not like that form-based present code
Mhm.
at all.
Who wrote that originally?
The guy, they're a major firm, the one that started that nonprofit that deals a lot with the.
In Boston, they were doing the same thing.
I'm
The
blanking on
first
his name.
4 or 5 floors was a parking
Yeah,
garage,
I mean,
and
he's
the residents
well-known.
were on top of it.
But,
Are you in Suffolk County now, or are you formerly?
no, I'm not now.
Just
I
good planning.
got bumped.
Hmm.
I was one of the at-large, and there were only 2. So, and I also did my homework, so the developers didn't always like what I had to say. But anyway, so it wasn't very interesting. But I really enjoyed it. And
So you think sometimes the form base is too much of a straitjacket in effect?
sometimes, yes.
Right,
I believe in proportion.
Right.
And I think that kind of form base and looking at alternatives, like I said, if you do relax the rules of not having it just in one building, you might actually get a better scale.
Right.
So that kind of form base, I
Right.
totally support.
Right.
But on CR 39, they were forgetting how the buildings were used
Right.
and creating a Disney, and some of the styles looked like they were from the South rather than New England. So, I thought it went too far.
Right.
Um,
I think that's, I'm without opining one way, or the other, I think that's what we're hearing from some of the local architects, that they think the current zoning and a little bit what some of the things we've done are placing them too much and having to do the same thing over and over again, because there's so few ways to create the amount of space they want and still be within the zoning.
Talking about the business center?
No, not the business center is the opposite, I think. I think the business center, there's many more options.
I think they refer, they want to have
Right.
flat roofs in order to get what they want. Get up to 35 foot and have a flat roof.
Well, there are ways of dealing with that.
Right.
There are alternative codes depending on the style of roof.
Right.
And also, I actually think you should have both form-based and performance.
Uh-huh.
Because somebody may think of something that you didn't. Because
Right.
if you have a form-based, you're saying, I've thought of everything.
Right.
You're not
That's a
leaving it
problem.
open,
Right.
Yeah.
So in the building code, they usually have either or.
Right.
So, and you can still say no to it, but it gives somebody that
Right.
freedom.
Right.
And maybe somebody will come up with something wonderful and you'll say,
Right.
hey, look at that
Right.
example, that's performance-based, maybe you want to consider that.
Also for us, one of the things I think we're trying to avoid is, you always do, zoning is always backward looking. So you're always doing zoning based on what's been happening, and then, 10 years later, you're in a different, so we're trying to, I think, as we look at zoning, we're trying to come up with things that live over time. And one thing I think we're very proud of on the Village Center is I think that zoning's gonna last for decades.
Yeah.
Because
I-
I
that
think
was
it
really well
provides
done.
so many options of how you can do it, that it doesn't straitjack you to just being what we think today is good. You could do it differently and still fit.
And
within-
allows to develop the way that we like,
Right,
the Main
right,
Street and
right.
John's Way.
And parking and
Right.
environmental concerns are more
Right.
important than they used to be.
Right.
So understanding how that
Right.
relates.
Right.
Do you have some parts that are in the flood zone
Mhm.
as part of this?
Yes, not as many of the small lots, but some of it, yes.
Because that's
Right.
also going,
Yes,
how
yes.
you integrate, that has a huge impact on the
right.
community. So understanding
Right,
all
right.
those environmental concerns is a new
Yep.
example.
Have you seen ways of dealing with proportion in code? Because, if you look at Post Crossing, you have a relatively vertical proportions, the Victorian homes. Some of the newer homes are moving out to the maximum envelope, so they're getting a more horizontal kind of expression on the street.
Mhm.
But, you could change the side lot a little bit, but it wouldn't necessarily change that ratio. So I don't know if there's any ways to deal with that kind of sense of proportion.
There are ways. I mean, the pyramid laws are a typical example, but there are other ways. I'm sure we could look
Your
at that.
little hand sketch with the different ways of putting buildings and trees and stuff, it was very interesting. And it's just moving blocks, basically.
Right.
And that's what it is. And
But
how-
it has a huge impact.
Yes, it does.
Right.
I mean, that's what architecture is all about.
Right.
It's a simple concept, but
Right.
I had a book on ladder back chairs, and the book was that thick,
Oh, my gosh.
and that's how many varieties. And it's
Right.
such a constrained
Right.
set of parameters,
these rungs?
but the variety
Right.
was incredible.
Right.
And that's what a community
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
so.
Interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.